people who built their wealth by buying goods in one place and selling them somewhere else for a profit. Their success depended on understanding markets, managing dangerous journeys, and having enough courage to invest their money in ventures that could either make them rich or leave them broke. The merchant lifestyle was fundamentally different from the agricultural focus that dominated most medieval occupations. Instead of growing things or making things, merchants moved things from where they were cheap to where they were expensive. They were basically medieval logistics experts, except their delivery trucks were ox-drawn wagons and their GPS was asking strangers for directions. Successful merchants specialized in different types of goods depending on their location and connections. Some focused on luxury items like spices, silk, or precious metals that were lightweight but extremely valuable. Others dealt in bulk commodities like salt, grain, or wool that were needed in large quantities. Travel was the most dangerous and expensive part of merchant life. Roads were full of bandits who specifically targeted merchant caravans because they carried valuable goods and money. Merchants had to hire guards, pay protection fees to local lords, and sometimes travel in large groups for safety. The equipment needed for merchant ventures was substantial and expensive. They needed sturdy wagons or pack animals to carry goods, weapons for protection, camping supplies for sleeping outdoors, and enough money to buy inventory and pay expenses along the way. Market knowledge was crucial for merchant success. They needed to know which goods were scarce in different cities, when seasonal demand would increase prices, and how political events might affect trade routes. Their market research involved actually going to markets and talking to people instead of reading reports. Credit and banking were essential parts of merchant operations because carrying large amounts of gold and silver was extremely dangerous. Merchants developed sophisticated systems for transferring money and managing international transactions. Seasonal patterns affected merchant activities because weather made travel difficult during certain times of year. Most long-distance trade happened during spring and summer when roads were passable and sailing was safer. Social status for merchants was complicated because they were often wealthier than nobles but didn't have the same legal privileges or social respect. They had more money than knights but couldn't wear fancy clothes or demand the same treatment. Competition among merchants was fierce because successful trade routes attracted multiple operators. Merchants had to offer better prices, faster delivery, higher quality goods, or superior service to win customers. Risk management was a constant concern because so many things could go wrong. Weather could delay shipments, wars could close trade routes, customers could refuse to pay, and thieves could steal entire inventories. The most successful merchants accumulated enough wealth to live like minor nobles, with fine houses, expensive clothes, and servants. Some used their wealth to buy land and eventually transition into the landed gentry, but not everyone was willing to risk their wealth on honest trade. Robber barons chose a dangerous path to wealth by controlling strategic locations and demanding payment from anyone who wanted to pass through safely. These were usually minor nobles or ambitious commoners who decided that taking money by force was easier than earning it through honest work. Unlike random bandits hiding in forests, robber barons operated sophisticated criminal enterprises. They built or seized castles, towers, or fortified positions that gave them control over valuable trade routes, river crossings, or mountain passes. They ran medieval toll booths, except instead of taking coins, they took whatever they wanted at sword point. Location was everything for robber baron success. A well-positioned castle or tower could control miles of territory and generate enormous income from forced tolls. The best spots were places where geography naturally funneled traffic. Narrow valleys, the only bridge across a river, or passes through mountain ranges. The business model was surprisingly sophisticated for what was essentially organized crime. Robber barons identified valuable trade routes, studied travel patterns, and calculated how much they could steal without completely killing the trade that made their operations profitable. Military organization was essential because robber barons needed enough armed men to intimidate travelers, but not so many that the costs ate up all their profits. A typical operation might include 20 to 50 fighters, along with servants and guards. Revenue streams extended beyond simple highway robbery. They might demand regular tribute from nearby villages, ransom prisoners for substantial payments, or sell protection services to merchants who wanted guaranteed safe passage. Their business plan was basically find creative ways to separate people from their money without actually working for it. Relationships with legitimate authorities were complex and constantly changing. Some robber barons had informal agreements with local lords who received shares of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. The lifestyle of successful robber barons could be quite luxurious, at least temporarily. They lived in fortified castles with all the comforts that stolen wealth could buy: fine food, expensive clothes, weapons, horses, and entertainment. Social acceptance varied dramatically depending on local politics. In some areas, robber barons were seen as rebels fighting against oppressive rulers. In others, they were viewed as dangerous criminals who made life miserable for everyone. The risk-to-reward ratio was extreme for robber barons. Successful operations could generate wealth comparable to major merchants, but failure often meant death, exile, or losing everything. The most successful robber barons eventually transitioned to legitimate roles by using their wealth and military experience to serve established rulers. Some became generals or governors. The key was knowing when to stop robbing and start negotiating. However, the military skills that made robber barons successful were exactly the same talents that legitimate rulers valued in their service. Knights represented the warrior aristocracy of medieval society, professional soldiers who received land grants in exchange for military service to their lords. They were expected to be masters of warfare, exemplars of Christian virtue, and leaders of rural communities. The path to knighthood usually began in childhood when boys from noble or wealthy families were sent to serve as pages in other households. They started their military careers as medieval apprentices, except instead of learning to fix things, they learned to break them with style. Training was intense and comprehensive, covering not just fighting skills, but also hunting, riding, courtly behavior, and basic education. Young men spent years learning to fight with swords, lances, maces, and other weapons while wearing heavy armor. The investment required to become and remain a knight was enormous. A full set of armor, weapons, and war horses could cost as much as a small village, and these items needed constant maintenance and replacement. Land ownership was the foundation of knight economic life because agricultural income supported their expensive military lifestyle. A knight's estate might include several villages, hundreds of peasants, mills, forests, and other resources that generated the wealth needed to maintain horses, weapons, and armor. Military obligations were the core of knight responsibility. They owed their lord a specific number of days of military service each year, usually around 40 days, though this could be extended during major campaigns. The code of chivalry was supposed to govern knight behavior, emphasizing courage, honor, protection of the weak, and Christian virtue. In practice, knights varied widely in how seriously they took these ideals. Some were genuinely heroic figures, while others were basically heavily armed bullies with fancy titles. Social relationships for knights were complex because they occupied middle positions in the feudal hierarchy. They owed loyalty to higher nobles while expecting the same from people on their lands. Economic pressures on knights increased over time as warfare became more expensive and agricultural income failed to keep pace with military costs. They were like military contractors whose government contracts didn't always cover their actual expenses. Tournament culture provided opportunities for knights to practice their skills, gain reputation, and win prizes during peacetime. These events were part sporting competition, part military training, and part social gathering. Religious duties were an important part of knight identity because they were expected to be Christian warriors who defended the faith. Some knights joined crusades to the Holy Land, while others fought against Muslims in Spain. Legal privileges included the right to bear arms, hold land directly from higher nobles, and participate in noble courts. They were exempt from many taxes and could only be judged by other nobles. The rise of professional armies gradually reduced the military importance of knights, though their social status remained high. Many adapted by becoming court officials or military commanders. However, the responsibilities and costs of knight life sometimes seem modest compared to those who controlled multiple estates and commanded several knights at once. Barons were major landowners who controlled vast territories and wielded significant political power within their regions. They owned multiple estates, commanded dozens or hundreds of knights, and served as key advisors to kings and dukes. The typical baron controlled several manors, each centered around a fortified castle or manor house. These estates might be scattered across different regions, requiring sophisticated management systems to collect rents, oversee agricultural production, and maintain military forces. Administrative complexity was enormous because barons had to coordinate activities across multiple properties while fulfilling obligations to higher authorities and managing relationships with subordinate knights. Most employed stewards, bailiffs, and clerks to handle day-to-day operations. Military power was the foundation of baron authority. They commanded feudal armies that included their own household knights, forces provided by subordinate nobles, and soldiers recruited from their lands. Their staff meetings were basically war councils with better food. Castle construction and maintenance consumed significant portions of baron wealth because these fortifications were essential for controlling territory and demonstrating power. A typical baron owned several castles of varying sizes. Political influence allowed barons to shape laws, policies, and decisions that affected entire kingdoms. They served on royal councils, participated in important court ceremonies, and often acted as regional governors. Economic resources came from multiple sources, including agricultural rents, taxes on trade, fees for using mills and markets, judicial fines, and profits from mining or forestry operations on their lands. Social obligations required barons to maintain elaborate households that reflected their status and provided hospitality to guests, allies, and subordinates. A baron's court might include dozens of knights, officials, servants, entertainers, and visitors. Marriage alliances were crucial because these relationships determined political partnerships, territorial expansion, and inheritance patterns. Baron marriages were major political events that could reshape regional power balances. Legal authority gave barons the right to hold courts, judge criminal cases, and impose punishments, including imprisonment or execution. They appointed local officials and controlled access to important resources. Religious patronage was expected from barons who were supposed to support churches, monasteries, and religious institutions on their lands. Many founded religious houses or participated in crusades. The most successful barons accumulated enough power and wealth to challenge royal authority or establish their own quasi-independent states. They were like medieval CEOs who decided their companies were big enough to become their own countries. However, some individuals achieved even greater influence through religious rather than purely secular authority. Dukes represented the highest level of nobility below royalty, controlling vast regions that might include dozens of baronies, hundreds of manors, and populations of hundreds of thousands of people. Their power and wealth were so substantial that they often functioned as independent rulers within their territories. The territories controlled by dukes were typically entire provinces or regions with distinct cultural and economic identities. A duchy might encompass major cities, important trade routes, valuable natural resources, and strategic military positions. They were basically running their own countries, except they still had to pretend the king was in charge at formal dinner parties. Administrative systems in duchies were sophisticated governmental structures that rivaled royal administrations. Dukes employed hundreds of officials, including stewards, treasurers, judges, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives. Military forces under ducal command were substantial armies that could determine the outcomes of major wars. A powerful duke might command several thousand knights, tens of thousands of foot soldiers, and significant numbers of archers and siege engineers. Complex because dukes had to balance loyalty to their kings with their own territorial interests, relationships with foreign powers, and obligations to subordinate nobles. Legal systems in duchies were comprehensive governmental structures that included multiple levels of courts, complex legal codes, and extensive bureaucracies for enforcing laws and collecting taxes. Marriage strategies for ducal families involved international negotiations that could reshape the political map of Europe. Ducal marriages were major diplomatic events that created alliances between kingdoms. The most powerful dukes accumulated enough authority to challenge royal power directly, sometimes becoming kings themselves through conquest, marriage, or political maneuvering. They were like regional managers who decided they were qualified to run the entire company. Yet even ducal power could be overshadowed by those who commanded spiritual rather than temporal authority over the faithful. Bishops wielded a unique combination of spiritual authority and temporal power that made them among the most influential people in medieval society. They controlled vast church lands, commanded enormous wealth, and exercised religious authority over hundreds of thousands of believers. The religious authority of bishops was absolute within their dioceses, giving them power over the spiritual lives of everyone from peasants to nobles. They controlled access to sacraments, determined religious doctrine, and could excommunicate people who defied church authority. They were like medieval CEOs of salvation, with the power to fire people from eternal happiness. Territorial control by bishops often rivaled that of secular nobles because the church owned enormous amounts of land donated by faithful believers over centuries. A typical bishop controlled hundreds of manors, dozens of monasteries, and significant urban properties. Administrative complexity in church governance required sophisticated bureaucratic systems to manage religious, legal, and economic affairs across large territories. Bishops employed hundreds of clerks, lawyers, accountants, and administrators. Economic resources available to bishops came from multiple sources, including tithes paid by all Christians, donations from wealthy believers, profits from church lands, fees for religious services, and income from pilgrimage sites. Political influence was enormous because bishops served as advisors to kings, participated in royal councils, and often held important government positions. Their political networking happened at places where everyone was required to show up every week and listen to them talk. Legal authority extended beyond religious matters because bishops controlled church courts that handled marriage disputes, inheritance cases involving church property, and crimes committed by clergy. Educational leadership was central to bishop responsibilities because the church controlled most schools, libraries, and centers of learning. Bishops determined curriculum, appointed teachers, and influenced intellectual development throughout their regions. Military power was significant for bishops who controlled fortified cities, maintained armed guards, and sometimes led armies in defense of church interests. While bishops weren't supposed to shed blood personally, they often commanded military forces. Cultural patronage by bishops supported artistic and intellectual achievements that influenced European civilization for centuries. They commissioned magnificent cathedrals, supported scholars and artists, and preserved classical learning. Daily responsibilities included conducting religious ceremonies, administering church business, hearing legal cases, managing properties, and maintaining relationships with secular and religious authorities. The most powerful bishops accumulated influence that rivaled or exceeded that of kings, especially in regions where church authority was particularly strong. Some became de facto rulers of independent territories. However, even bishops had to respect the financial power of those who controlled the flow of money itself. Bankers occupied a unique and often dangerous position in medieval society. They were among the wealthiest individuals of their time, yet they were frequently despised and sometimes killed by the very people who depended on their financial services. The banking business was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Bankers developed complex systems for transferring money across vast distances, managing international currency exchanges, and providing credit for major commercial and political ventures. They were running medieval Wall Street, except their biggest worry wasn't market crashes, but actual mobs with pitchforks. Capital accumulation for bankers began with modest money-changing operations in market towns, where they exchanged different types of coins and provided basic financial services to merchants. Successful money changers gradually expanded into lending operations and major banking houses. International operations were essential for banking success Because the most profitable opportunities involve financing long-distance trade, managing currency exchanges between different regions, and providing credit for ventures that cross political boundaries. Risk management was crucial for banker survival because their business involved enormous potential losses from bad loans, currency fluctuations, political upheavals, and default by borrowers. Their risk assessment basically consisted of figuring out which kings were likely to pay back their loans versus which ones might just execute them instead. Political relationships were both essential and dangerous because bankers often lent money to kings and nobles who had the power to cancel debts, seize assets, or simply kill their creditors when repayment became inconvenient. Religious persecution was a constant threat for many bankers, especially those who were Jewish, because church law prohibited Christians from charging interest on loans. This created opportunities for non-Christian bankers, but also made them vulnerable to persecution and violence. Urban development was significantly influenced by banker investments because they had the capital needed for major infrastructure projects, real estate development, and commercial ventures that shaped the growth of medieval cities. Family business structures were common because trust was essential in financial operations, and family members were more reliable than outside partners. Many banking dynasties lasted for generations. Legal challenges faced by bankers included complex inheritance laws, different legal systems in various jurisdictions, and the constant threat of debt cancellation by powerful borrowers. Cultural impact of banking extended beyond purely economic matters because wealthy bankers became major patrons of art, architecture, and learning. Banking families funded magnificent palaces and sponsored artists and scholars. The most successful bankers accumulated so much wealth and influence that they could determine the fate of kingdoms, though their power ultimately depended on the favor of those who claimed divine authority to rule. Kings stood at the apex of medieval society, wielding absolute authority over their realms and controlling resources that dwarfed even the wealthiest nobles and bankers. They claimed divine right to rule, commanded vast armies, and lived in luxury that was literally unimaginable to most of their subjects. The wealth of medieval kings was theoretically unlimited because they legally owned all land in their kingdoms and could demand taxes, tribute, and military service from everyone under their authority. They were the ultimate landlords, except their rental agreements were enforced by armies instead of lawyers. Royal administration required massive bureaucratic systems to govern territories that might span hundreds of thousands of square miles and millions of people. Kings employed thousands of officials, including stewards, treasurers, judges, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives. Military power was the foundation of royal authority because kings needed armies to defend against foreign invasion, suppress internal rebellions, and enforce their will throughout their territories. Royal armies included professional soldiers, feudal levies from noble vassals, and mercenary forces. Economic control extended to every aspect of commerce and production within royal territories. Kings minted coins, regulated trade, collected customs duties, and controlled access to valuable resources like forests, mines, and fishing rights. Political authority was absolute in theory, but required constant negotiation with powerful nobles, church leaders, and wealthy merchants who had their own sources of power and influence. Successful kings learned to balance competing interests while maintaining their supreme authority. Legal systems throughout kingdoms were controlled by royal courts that interpreted laws, judged criminal cases, and resolved disputes involving major property or political issues. Kings had the power to create laws, grant pardons, and impose punishments up to and including execution. Diplomatic relationships with foreign rulers were crucial for royal success because medieval kingdoms existed in a complex web of alliances, trade agreements, marriage contracts, and territorial disputes. Religious authority was closely connected to royal power because kings claimed divine sanction for their rule and often controlled important church appointments and religious policies. The relationship between royal and papal authority was a source of constant tension. Cultural leadership was expected from kings who were supposed to embody the highest ideals of their civilization and support artistic, intellectual, and architectural achievements that reflected royal glory. Marriage strategies for royal families were major political events that could reshape the map of Europe through alliances, inheritance claims, and territorial transfers. Royal marriages were negotiated like international treaties. Daily life for kings involved constant ceremonial duties, administrative responsibilities, military planning, and political negotiations. They lived in magnificent palaces surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, servants, guards, and advisors. Succession disputes were among the most dangerous threats to royal authority because unclear inheritance laws, competing claimants, and ambitious nobles could trigger civil wars that destroyed entire kingdoms. Their estate planning was basically, hope nobody kills me before I figure out who should inherit everything. Justice administration was a major royal responsibility because people expected kings to provide fair legal systems and protection from crime and oppression. Royal courts handled the most important legal cases. Financial management for royal treasuries required sophisticated accounting systems and careful planning because kings had enormous expenses for military forces, administrative bureaucracies, diplomatic missions, and ceremonial requirements. Personal security was a constant concern because kings faced threats from assassins, rebels, foreign enemies, and ambitious relatives who might want to seize the throne. Royal palaces were heavily fortified, and kings were surrounded by guards. The most successful kings built dynasties that lasted for centuries, expanded their territories through conquest and diplomacy, and left legacies that influenced the development of entire civilizations. They accumulated wealth and power that seemed almost godlike to their contemporaries. From the desperate beggars sleeping in ditches to the mighty kings ruling from golden thrones, medieval society was a complex hierarchy where birth, luck, skill, and sometimes violence determined whether someone lived in luxury or died in poverty. Each level brought its own challenges and opportunities, but the gap between the top and bottom was so vast that they might as well have been living in completely different worlds.